Doctors and surgeons of Reddit, what was your "this just got even worse" moment with your patient/s? Doctor here. You may have heard that diabetics need to have their eyes checked regularly because diabetes is actually a blinding condition. This happened probably about 15 years ago, but this patient of mine I had noted had severe diabetic vascular changes against the retina and required laser intervention as soon as possible. Without getting into the socio-economic arguments here, she scheduled her surgery and on the day of the surgery decided to take a work day instead of her surgery. Her job was cleaning, and on that fateful day, she inhaled some of her cleaner fumes which caused her to sneeze, spiking her blood pressure, and she blew the fragile blood vessels in both of her eyes wide open and blood started gushing into her eyes. As you might imagine, blood is opaque. You can't see through it. She was instantly and completely blinded in both eyes in a matter of seconds. It took 3 years, multiple surgeries, and a complete lifestyle change, but this patient did recover to have actually fair, but not good, vision. I still see her now for her annual visits. A little late to the party, but I'll chime in. When I was a medical student on my surgery rotation, I was working a 24 and was with the trauma team. I'm observing a simple repair of a duodenal perforation in the OR when my trauma pager goes off. Ask my senior if I can leave to see what's going on and he gives me the go-ahead. Run into the trauma bay and a youngish gentleman is brought in on a stretcher with the lower half of his body covered in blood, but very obviously awake and coherent. He's screaming, "They shot my balls! They shot my fucking balls, man!" And they had. He had been shot 15 times all below the belt, one of which had gone straight through his scrotum. We're doing an evaluation on this distraught man when a code is called in the next pod over in the ed. That's weird, they usually don't call overhead for codes in the ed. Someone pops their head into the trauma bay. It's the patient who was brought in with this guy. Oh fuck. Several of us run away from stable scrotum shot guy and into the next pod to see a young woman lying on a stretcher receiving CPR. What happened? We don't know, she just crashed. Go to roll the patient to get her clothes off and we notice she's bleeding out of her back out of the tiniest exit wound. She was an unintended victim of the drive-by. She's now our patient. We take her to the trauma bay and immediately take off all her clothes to perform the primary surgery. She's not breathing and has no pulse, intubate. Sure as shit, once we get her entirely exposed we see a very small entry wound right into the center of her chest. Ultrasound confirms massive hemothorax. Place a chest tube and 2 liters of blood gush out onto the floor. Oh fuck. We need to convert to open, says my attending resident I'm with immediately takes a scalpel and creates a longitudinal incision along the inferior aspect of the rib spaces and uses a pair of medical gardening shears to clip the sternum in half. Basically, the patient has had their chest pried open horizontally in a crazy procedure called a clamshell thoracotomy, look it up. At this point we can visualize the heart and notice there was a clean entry and exit wound straight through this patient's heart. All of the blood and fluids we were pushing were just draining right out of her heart and into her chest. Surgical attending is performing manual cardiac massage, CPR, with your hands on the actual heart. We need to go to the OR. Rush down to the OR with this patient and the attending attempts to sew up the holes in her heart. Just as she's putting the final sutures into the patient, I begin to notice the patient oozing blood from every single opening in her body. Doc, I think this patient is in DIC. Oh fuck. Patient is now floridly experiencing a phenomenon known as disseminated intravascular coagulopathy, DIC, which is basically when you use up all of your clotting agents and just bleed out of everywhere. Okay, we need to close for now. Patient is transferred to the PsyCU where I monitor her progress for 3 fucking weeks. She has watershed infarctions across her entire brain from how long it went without perfusion. She can't talk or move. Having end-of-life discussions with the family about a young woman who isn't even old enough to drink. I leave the service and follow her until one day I don't see her name anymore. Next day I'm in a surgery with the trauma attending and she says, "Hey, our shooting patient went home today. She's a quadriplegic, but she's alive." That sucks, I respond. Fast forward 6 months and I'm working in the psychu again. I bring up this patient to a neurointensivist attending because I think it's a cool story. Her eyes opened so wide. I saw that patient in the ICU and told the family she was going to die. When she didn't die, I told them she would be a quad. Then a month ago I had a follow-up visit with her and she walked into my clinic with nothing to show for her experience except a scar from her thoracotomy. The 80-year-old who came in with a self-inflicted shotgun wound to the chest. As we are fighting to get him stabilized and the surgeons are working to plug all the holes, none of us can figure out why the guy keeps oozing blood. Then we find out that he had intentionally overdosed on blood thinners before shooting himself. We kept him alive long enough to let the family come into the OR and say goodbye. The 45-year-old who came in via private car, family drove him in, rather than an ambulance, after what was described as a head injury. We realized how bad it was when someone noticed a plastic grocery bag lying on the patient's belly. It contained the brains that the family managed to scoop up, in the hopes that we could reimplant them. The 30-something meth addict who also had a permanent catheter infusing life-saving medication directly into his chest for pulmonary hypertension. He came into the ICU with pH crisis, and then we found out why. He had been injecting meth into the catheter, creating a hole through which his life-saving medication leaked out. Medicine is a lot of things. Sometimes it's just tragic. Not a doctor or surgeon, but a patient. I went into my GP with a swollen throat. No big deal, just some antibiotics and numbing spray will do the trick for strep. Well, it wasn't strep. I can still see the look on the doc's face when she felt my throat, looked down, and said, "I'm calling an ambulance to take you to the hospital right now." I had a cyst the size of a golf ball in my neck muscle, closing off my throat/airway. I thought the pain from swallowing and breathing was just from strep irritation, turns out it's because even air was hardly able to squeeze through. How did it get there? Who knows? But it had to be removed immediately. Shit thing is, it happened again 2 years later, but got even bigger, even faster. I was gasping for air when they rushed me to surgery the second time. Now I'm just missing a huge chunk of muscle in my neck, to lower the odds of it happening again, since no one knows why it happened. I have limited neck movement now, and get regular neck cramps/painful tightness if I open my mouth too wide, yup, like yawning. TLDR, what I thought was strep throat turned out to be a massive cyst in my neck, blocking my throat and airway. Went from a normal GP visit to an emergency surgery. Happened again 2 years later. EMT. We had a man in his late 40s that lived with his invalid mother in a run-down trailer out in the middle of the country that first called us to have us check on his hyperglycemia. He was 450 mg/dl, which is the highest my partner or I have even seen, and advised him to go to the hospital. He was morbidly obese and wasn't taking care of his type 2 diabetes in even the slightest. He refused any attempt to have EMS transportation to ER. We couldn't force him into the ambulance, so we had no choice but to leave him, but advised our medical control, doctor in charge, of the incident as soon as we got back into the ambulance. 2 months later we get a call back to his trailer by a third-party caller again for his diabetes. This time his feet have gangrene and we can see the exposed bones of his toes. I mean, all 10 of his toes have had the soft tissue eaten away to down to just the bone. This time he wasn't the least bit hesitant, but we still can't believe he had gone 2 weeks like this. It was a surgery rotation when I was still in medical school. Middle-aged lady brought in unconscious, pale, and possibly bleeding internally because she stabbed herself multiple times in the abdomen because her husband cheated on her. We immediately cut her abdomen open trying to find the source of bleeding. After a few moments, we were able to stabilize her and checked every segment of her intestines for any bleeding. We located a few and were able to cauterize and suture and whatnot. There was actually one stab wound that missed a major artery by millimeters. As we were placing back the guts into the cavity, my chief resident decided to take one more look underneath and he accidentally opened up a big artery, most likely had an initial slight damage to it due to the patient, and it started bleeding like crazy. Reminded me of that famous scene from The Shining. We had to call the chief surgeon stat, even though he was on vacation, but he answered and was calm and told us what to do in a calm manner via the phone. I was so scared shitless, really thought the patient was a goner when I saw that massive hemorrhage happen before my own eyes. We were able to control the bleeding by a combination of aggressive cautery and some pressure and suturing. Definitely something I won't forget. The patient was able to live and I was able to talk to her a few days later as she recovered in the ICU bed, but man, that was a crazy experience in the operating room. One of the more action-packed day as a medical student. I am now a graduate, planning to land a residency somewhere this cycle. P.S. Just remembered that this was my very first day of surgery rotation ever too. Pick 1. These were all from my intern year in general surgery in the late 90s. The beautiful 34-year-old woman who manned a grill for 2 days during some sort of weekend festival for her church. Her eyes got irritated from the smoke off the grill, so she asked her PMD for some eye drops. After using them for 2 days she developed a rash. They were tobramycin drops, that rapidly progressed to cover her whole body. She developed TENS, aka toxic epidermal necrolysis syndrome, which essentially means the most superficial layer of the skin, epidermis, separates from the deeper layers, dermis. This leaves a wound that is similar to the raw spot underneath a big blister, but in her case it involved nearly 75% of her skin. She also developed GI bleeding, as the mucous membranes, the moist tissues that line the inside of your mouth, esophagus, stomach, and intestines, also separates and bleeds. At the time we had silver-impregnated dressings, Acticoat, that we had to wrap her in like a mummy and change every day. Despite everything we could do at the main burn unit in a huge metro area in the Midwest, she died. The husband and wife who were brought in at the same time, both with major flame burns. He was about 50% TBSA, total body surface area, and she was 75%. The woman was intubated at the original ER they went to. Big burns are literally hot potatoes and will get transferred to the nearest burn center ASAP when they arrive in a small town ER. She was waking up a bit when she got to our unit and kept trying to mouth something around her breathing tube. In hindsight, I'm pretty sure it was my baby, as she miscarried about 36 hours after she was admitted. Her nurse found the fetus in her bed. She developed an arrhythmia while we were starting a new central line, big 4 in the neck or chest, and we couldn't stop it. And she died. We later found out that the husband put their 2 kids in the car, then went back inside and choked her till she passed out, and then poured gasoline all over her and lit her on fire after he found out she was pregnant with someone else's baby. He also caught on fire. Gasoline will do that. He survived, got multiple skin grafts and went to jail. The kids were uninjured, physically. That was during the first 3 weeks I was a doctor. Edited because mobile format is hard, and to clarify what happened to the husband and kids. Obligatory, not a doctor, but I was a forensic technician assisting forensic pathologists at autopsy. One day, the chief and I were doing 3 routine narcotic OD autopsies. Oftentimes with ODs, our doctors would let us, the techs, do the whole evisceration to save time, so all the doc had to do was to examine the individual organs. So on the 3rd decedent, she gave me the green light to start cutting. Once I had the chest plate removed, something didn't look quite right with his lungs. I called over the doc and she takes one look and goes, "I really hope you have your mask on as tight as it can possibly be." Her next words were terrifying. "That's tuberculosis." We immediately had to inform the Public Health Commission, kick everyone else out of the autopsy room, and convert our deco room, where we primarily did the exams of decomposed people, and turn on the extra-duty ventilation system, and had to complete the exam with the full PAPR kit on. That was fun. Not a doc, but I used to work for radiology in a small hospital and was there kinda Mr. Everything we don't want to do, lifting, security, transport, babysitter, etc. A young mid-20s couple gets brought in on backboards after a car wreck. Middle of February, ICAF, and the guy rolled the car. The girl gets a bed in the ER. She's mostly fine, beat up quite a bit but still coherent and talking. A state trooper is in her room with her. The dude is complaining but overall seems fine. She's asking me to see him and I tell her that they're stabilizing him and he's not going anywhere. She says, "What does that mean?" Over and over again, and I tell her that he's in a bed on a board, so he can't move. She's freaking out. I take the guy back to radiology, he's talking and joking, things seem fine. We do the CT and his spine is broke, not just broke, severed. Guy is in for some serious surgery, rehab, might never walk again kinda stuff. The girl runs out of the room, cop chases after her, they start fighting. A little 110 pounds girl is straight up squaring up with this big ass cop. Cop ends up tasering her in the middle of the ER. Her dude is screaming because they told him about his spine, his girl is now chained to a bed. Turns out they were running drugs, high as eagle balls, flipped the car and the dude probably never walked again. I always wonder though. Hospital social worker here, we get called when things go from bad to worse in other ways. My first day as a student social worker in the ICU, we had a family meeting for a patient who went to his local emergency room for shortness of breath. Turns out his cancer was back with a vengeance and tumors were blocking his airway and surgery was not an option. He was brought to the ICU and had breathing tube inserted, but he kept pulling his tube out in the night. The guy was deteriorating fast and he communicated to us that he wanted to die. Well, a different kind of complication arose. His young adult children informed us that their mom was on life support in another ICU one town over after having a massive heart attack. Her prognosis was somewhat unclear but better than her husband's. So my supervisor, with my extremely white and teary-eyed self in tow, went to tell the patient that his wife had a massive heart attack and that she couldn't come see him before he died if he agreed to a one-way extubation, meaning the breathing tube isn't going back in if he pulls it out or the team takes it out, right away. However, the best ICU team ever had a plan. They brought his wife to our ICU so they could see each other before he died. It was a huge undertaking that required a lot of resources, organizing, and skill, but they got her there and they were reunited for a short period of time before the husband died. She didn't have any memory of being wheeled into her husband's room, another huge production, but they had pictures that she could see. She did eventually wake up and recover somewhat, and we had to have another very hard conversation with her about how she ended up in another ICU and that her husband died. But those boys didn't lose both their parents in one go, and one man died knowing that his wife was being cared for in the next room. That was my first week in the ICU. Bad got worse, but then it got a bit better. My supervisor had a quote framed in her office that said something to the effect that hope springs eternal, but sometimes we have adjust our hopes to meet reality. Meaning, sometimes we can't hope for recovery, but we can hope for a peaceful and safe end for ourselves and the ones we love. I work in social work research and policy now, but I wouldn't trade my time working in the ICU, I worked in the same ICU after I graduated too, for anything. If this story sounds familiar, it made local news when the children took the story and photos to the Kingston Whig Standard, and then major news outlets picked it up. Nurse here. Midwife let a mom go through over 8 hours of the pushing stage of birth to the point the mom went into severe decompensation, blood pressure plummets, saturation drops, fetal distress, etc. In Canada, midwives practice separately from doctors and nurses. They usually just have an agreement with hospitals to use the beds, although medical care is available if the delivery becomes high risk. Doctors take over and go in for emergency C-section. Realize the arteries in the sides of the uterus are ruptured due to pulling away from the strained uterus and extensive pushing. Baby came out fine, but they had to work on mom. Finally close her up only for mom's pressure to plummet again. They open her back up and realize another artery was bleeding, so they clamped her aorta until they could repair the damage. I.e., Her lower body didn't receive blood flow for several minutes. They replaced her blood volume at least 3 times throughout. Finally the team stabilized her but were afraid of anything else unexpected, so they packed her but left the wound open, then sent her to ICU. I received baby in NICU. Baby was okay. Mom survived, although didn't find out much more. Homeless man is brought into the ED by EMS for a foot wound that is giving him trouble. We eyeball his foot that's poking out from the blanket as he's rolling by, and it's a little roughed up, but doesn't seem too bad. We go in to get his story and he says he hurt his foot a few days ago and that it just hurts to walk on. We ask if we can take a peek, so he whips off the blanket to show us his other foot, the one that is actual hurt, releasing a horrific stench cloud in the process. We knew we were in for a treat. Guy has his foot bandaged in a very dirty ace wrap, toes are completely black and necrotic, and there's a maggot butt wiggling near the edge of the ace wrap. We tried to remove the wrap, but it was stuck together with blood, dirt, and who knows what else, so time to cut that sucker off. As we cut, more maggot began to present themselves, and the smell of dead flesh just kept getting more and more intense. We finally make it through and go to pull away the wrap, and I swear at least 100 maggot fell out of that thing. But that wasn't the worst part. The entire bottom of the man's foot was stuck to the wrap and just fell away from the underlying muscle and bone. We told the man we were unfortunately not going to be able to save the foot, to which he responded, "Oh man, really? I didn't think it was that bad." We told the man we were unfortunately not going to be able to save the foot, to which he responded, "Oh man, really? I didn't think it was that bad." I had a patient with a similar sensibility. Story isn't quite as graphic, but it's just as bewildering. Patient came in with an badly infected foot abscess, entire foot was showing signs of cellulitis, and we had to put her on Vanco for a few days of inpatient care. She was paying out of pocket and kept trying to leave AMA, but we kept her for a few days to try and finish the treatment. When the infection was mostly cleared, she was discharged and given ABX prescriptions, appointments to attend a wound clinic to monitor the abscess, etc. Also, we gave her strict instructions to change the bandages, monitor the wound, keep it clean, etc. If it gets worse, call us, etc. She did none of those things. She never picked up the antibiotics from the pharmacy. She skipped her wound clinic appointments, and when we tried to contact her, she had apparently dropped off the grid and was unreachable. We later found out this was because she went on vacation. Several days after getting home, and after deciding to skip picking up the antibiotics, she decided to go on a 2-week-long camping and river rafting trip with some friends. Let me repeat that. She had an open abscess on her foot that was recovering from infection. We told her to keep it dry and clean, and she went river rafting with it. Regardless, the camping trip was cut short after the first week because she developed septicemia, and her friends drove her a local hospital, which then airlifted her back to our hospital. She survived, but we amputated the leg above the knee. I have never felt less empathy for someone getting an amputation.